Today I'm going to be taking a look at Aster, a piece of software that lets you split one PC so that multiple users can use it at the same time. Unlike other methods of splitting a PC to have multiple users use it, this one does not use virtual machines and is a little bit more forgiving in terms of hardware. So for example, you can have multiple users playing games on the same graphics card at the same time. This video is actually a follow-up of one I did previously, linked up here somewhere, where I looked at it and I'm trying to answer a lot of the questions I saw in the comments and just other issues I saw with the software and tried to go a lot more in depth. So I went over a lot of different use cases and issues in here, and I'm going to be going over those results that I've had. Aster is a pretty simple program to set up and use. Unlike other methods of having multiple users using the same PC at the same time, like using virtual machines, this method is almost plug and play. You download the program, you install it, and then you set up virtual workstations where you give users resources. So for example, each user needs to have their own keyboard, monitor, and mouse, and then you can give them things like audio devices and others. I'm going to play with which devices and how they kind of work a little bit later in this video, but in general, it's a pretty simple give devices, and I didn't really see any weird hardware issues. For example, virtual machines often require like IOMMU groups to be set up, and if you want USB hot swap, you have to have separate devices and controllers, whereas Aster does have its own quirks for sure. I'd say in general it's a lot smoother, and the chance that your existing computer, especially if it's reasonably powerful, could use Aster to support a second user is likely higher than using virtual machines. And also you can run it on top of your existing Windows install. So you won't need to reinstall Windows or change your OS that's running underneath it. It can also be relatively easily restored to a standard single-user PC if needed. For my test system I was using today, I was using an older gaming PC. It's a reasonable representation of a lot of just kind of generic gaming PCs, and I had some other hardware and graphics cards to swap in as needed during testing. But the base specs that were used for most of the test was a 3770K, 16 gigabytes of RAM, a 500 gigabyte SATA SSD, and an RX 480 graphics card. I also added a GTX 1080 if I needed a second high-performance GPU to test with. During testing, I also made frequent backups and restores so I could easily roll back to an older state. The first thing I did for testing was just installing Aster. It's a quick little download from the website, and then I just followed the installation procedures. Once the program was installed, I could run the little program and tell it to activate the 30-day trial, which I used for this test. I then set up 3 workstations for the 3 monitors, keyboards, and mice I had, and assigned them to the users. It was pretty simple. I set it up wrong once, but then I could fix it and just work again. And once I had my configuration set up, it would just stick and continue to work that way. Once I had finished this initial setup, I started to get into testing. The first thing I wanted to start testing and looking into more was performance, and did some basic benchmarking. So I first took a look at CPU performance using mostly Blender. The default configuration in Aster allows every user to have full access to the CPU, so they can use all the CPU's resources. And the Windows scheduler kind of splits out how much time each user gets. And it overall is okay for relatively light loads like web browsing, where there might be a peak but then it goes back down to a relatively low load. But if you're using a sustained heavy load, so for example like the Blender renders, each user session you could kind of notice it was a bit slower. And if one user is using it, the others were a bit slower. And if 2 users were running like a Blender render, the 3rd user was almost unusably slow. Opening a web browser would take like 20 or 30 seconds, so it was almost unusable. Aster has one way to control CPU usage, and it's with core pinning. So you could say how many cores or threads does each user have access to on the CPU. So I tried limiting the CPU that was rendering on the user session, and so the Blender render now only had access to 6 of the 8 threads on that CPU. And doing that actually smoothed it out quite a bit. So the other users would continue to web browse fine. When the web browsers were like loading a heavy page, it would kind of peak and still struggle a little bit, but then it would work fine. My kind of mentality for this, if I was to set it up for a longer term, was just kind of experiment with it. If I didn't need to touch it, I probably wouldn't. But if the performance becomes an issue or users notice stuttering, kind of maybe take a few cores off each user and over-provision it a bit. I'm kind of generally in favor of over-provisioning for user sessions just because most of the time CPU usage for a user is quite low and you want to allow bursts to go so they can kind of burst and use more performance. If users have a sustained load, like maybe for example rendering, I'd just say pin each user and give each user like a couple cores. The disadvantage with dedicating resources to each user is if a user isn't using CPU, that extra CPU resources can't be shared to other users that might need it. So that's why I generally like to over-provision if I can do so without impacting performance. Looking at the render times in Blender, if I had multiple users running it at the same time, it was pretty much equally split. So if one user rendered it in 4 minutes, 2 users could render it in 8. And there's no way I could find out to really set priority between users. I could do so on an app basis in Task Manager, but without some scripts I couldn't force it to do it for a given user. And from all I can see, those CPU core pinnings are the only way to affect like priority and usage between multiple users. The next thing I decided to take a look at was graphics performance. For most of my graphics performance testing, I was using Unigine superposition just to get an easy number for comparison of performance. Having only one session running superposition, I got about the same score that I would just having a normal PC setup, so having the extra monitor being driven didn't really affect performance at all. And with that second user that wasn't using the game, performance felt fine. There was every once in a while like a stutter web browsing and scrolling, but quite rare. And this seems to be tied to the amount of frame rate the game has. So if you're playing a game that's running at like 60 FPS, the other users are fine. But if your game's like struggling and you're running the settings very high, and maybe it's 20 FPS, then the other users are kind of almost tied to 20 FPS and it will be much more stuttery performance-wise. Aster also gives the ability to have multiple users running those graphically intensive programs at the same time. So I tried doing that. So I had 2 users fire up superposition at the same time. Both of the instances appeared to run fine. There was no significant stuttering or issues I could notice watching the benchmark run. And the performance was essentially halved with 2 of them running, so it seemed to about equally split performance. Aster doesn't have a way to change GPU performance and saying like you get more of the GPU than another user. It pretty much just seems to be how does the GPU driver decide to split it between users on the system. Or for the driver's perspective, it's just applications. I tried having 3 systems running Unigine superposition, and with the settings I was using, it would essentially just completely have awful performance and stutter all out. And that seemed to be due to a VRAM cap. Because my RX 480 only has 4 GB of VRAM and each session was using a little bit under 2, when I had 3 running it would just not be able to cope with it and I would have to like swap out the system memory, which is extremely slow. So if you're doing a setup like this, probably try to get a higher VRAM card because you're essentially adding the VRAM requirements of all the graphically intensive programs you're using at the same time. The next thing I took a look at was adding a second graphics card. So I added that GTX 1080 I had to see how well I could have 2 reasonably high performance cards in the system and how well they'd work together. So Aster just kind of works with a second card. It pretty much is plug and play as long as the drivers are installed for both cards and Windows can see monitors on both. One of Aster's limitations is you have to have each monitor in one session connected to one graphics card. So for example, if I had a session with 3 monitors, in this case they'd either have to all be plugged into the 480 or all be plugged into the 1080. I couldn't do half and half. But pretty much 2 graphics cards worked fine and basically fully solved all the performance issues I had with like one game and other users like basic tasks like web browsing being stuttery. I could have a GTX 1080 in there, put whatever heavy load I want, and users connected to the 480 session would be just as smooth as always. And it pretty much always seemed to work. All the basic graphically intensive programs and games I tried would just use the graphics card that their display was connected to and just kind of work that way. I didn't have any issues with having to pick a certain graphics card. The only time it actually did come up where you could pick graphics cards was if you're using compute applications like OpenCL or CUDA. And in those cases, like Blender rendering or other 3D graphics or video editing programs, you can normally pick which graphics cards. And in that case, Aster didn't really affect that at all. So if you have multiple users doing a compute, you'll likely have to tell them or somehow script it in them that you should use these graphics cards, because the OS itself and Aster will not pick that for you. One other thing that can be done is if you have one high-performance graphics card where someone's playing a game and want like a second web browsing session, it might be a good idea to get a graphics card like a GT 710 or a 1030 or like a 5450 that's really low end, just so that they can push that gaming card as hard as they want, and the second session, which is web browsing, won't be affected or have any stuttering. But I'd say give it a try on your normal graphics card, because for most of my testing it was fine running a game on one GPU and web browsing or doing light tasks on the other. I ran a few games across all the monitors to see how it works, and from my experience, lightweight and more esportsy titles like Team Fortress 2 or League of Legends would run fine on all of them, even on like a GTX or RX 480 that I had, and would do it. I think the only thing is you don't want to push it too hard, so if your graphics card's only getting 60 FPS with one user, having two, expect around 30 and it won't be great. So you're going to either have to significantly lower settings or find a lighter rate game to run when you have multiple users using it at the same time. One other request I had to look into in the comments was having multiple sessions on the same monitor. I tried a few ways to do this. First of all, a lot of monitors have multiple video inputs. And if you set it up with the separate keyboard and mice and video inputs, you can use that monitor to switch between multiple sessions on the same monitor by switching inputs. I didn't have any issues there, seemed to work fine. Using a KVM switch should also have the same result there. The next thing I tried was seeing if I could software split a monitor in like half. And the only software I could find that could do that was Display Fusion, and while it splits it normally, it still shows up as one monitor in Windows and Aster, so I couldn't have Aster separate the separate halves into two users. The only way I could think of having multiple users with their own sessions on one monitor would be to have a monitor that does it in hardware. So I know some like LG, like ultra-wides or larger monitors let you do like a 2x2 tiles, each with their own input. And that would work here with Aster, where you could have 4 users, each using their own corner of the monitor at the same time. Controllers were the next thing I took a look at. I had 2 controllers on the PC and gave each session one of them and tried playing a game that supported controllers, in this case TF2, and it just worked fine. I could use one controller to control one session, switch over to the other controller and control the other session. I could just drag and drop it in Aster and it showed up as like a little controller icon. I didn't have to select controllers or had any issues in the games with it. So it looks like controllers just work. I did a little bit of testing with USB devices and tried to use some of the weirder devices, but unfortunately I don't have too many weird USB devices to test. The first thing I looked at was USB storage, and by default USB storage shows up to all the users and sessions, but you can tell it to limit it to a certain session if you want. I'd also suggest with USB storage, if it's something other than a flash drive, like a hard drive or something, just use permissions to limit access instead of Aster. It makes more sense for most users in my opinion. The next thing I took a look at was webcams. In this case I was using a Canon EOS Webcam Utility. By default the webcam is accessible to all users, and whoever grabs the webcam first can use it. But you can also use Aster to give a webcam to a specific user, and I'd assume it works fine with multiple webcams. One issue with these multi-point-like setups is that many game programs like Steam only want to have one version of their software running on each system at a time, no matter how many users you have logged in. One way I found to get around this was Sandboxy. Sandboxy is a little program you can run that lets you run programs as sandboxed. So that way they're kind of hidden from the rest of the system, and in the case of Steam, it doesn't know there's already Steam installed. And it makes like a separate little directory to put Steam in that hides it from the other one and makes it think the system doesn't have Steam running. And for Steam in my testing, it worked pretty much flawlessly. There was a little bit of setting up a container, and then I had to re-download the game for each session of Sandboxy, and I'd have to kind of reinstall it and re-log in, but after doing that, it pretty much worked. Performance of the game was exactly as I expected. Steam functioned as expected, and it was pretty simple to use overall. One extra step of just kind of when running Steam, right-click, run with Sandbox, and select the container you want. But that's 5 or 10 extra seconds for a solution that almost just worked for me. Now, one thing I do worry about is anti-cheat software. A lot of anti-cheat software really likes to monitor what exactly is going on your system, and they don't seem to like VM setups and just any of these weird multi-user setups, as they're kind of thinking that your setup might potentially be playing with RAM or other system files that could let you cheat. I don't have any experience, I haven't seen anything, but it might be possible that you could get blocked for cheating with these sorts of setups just due to how they're playing with the system underneath. The next thing I investigated a bit was screen capture. So one of the things that Aster actually says is don't use GeForce Experience. So I had to try using GeForce Experience, and it was the weirdest thing. You launch the overlay and it shows up on another session's monitor other than the one you're using. And the screen capture says it's working, but I never got a file recorded from it. Don't use it, they're right, it's bad. My guess is it's doing something where it's actually pulling directly from the frame buffer or writing to it with their overlay, unlike most software which is kind of using the Windows tool instead of the actual graphics hardware. This is great because it allows a much smaller performance impact for recording, but doesn't work with Aster here, unfortunately. So I tried a lot of other screen recording software. I tried OBS, I tried the Xbox recording in there, I tried AMD's Relive software, and all of those worked fine. Without any issues, the quality looked about fine. I could actually even have all three of my sessions recording the screen with OBS using hardware on my AMD card at the same time with no frame drops. So it seems to only be NVIDIA's GeForce Experience that has issues here, and none of the other screen cap software I've had could find it. I don't think there's really a workaround, due to how it probably interfaces with the graphics card underneath. But fortunately, for most of the reasons you could use GeForce Experience, there's other programs that can do similar tasks. The other thing I heard about was how secure is the software, it's what is it talking to, it's created by a Russian company that isn't super well known, and unfortunately I can't speak too much to it. I tried doing a basic network capture, and the only thing I could see it talking to was during setting up the trial and when it was activating the key, likely doing their activation servers. I didn't see any other network traffic, but they can hide it. There's other ways to get around it. So, it's probably not the most trusted software out there, but it doesn't seem to be a massive security threat also. Now I'm going to go over some of the notes and weird issues I had when playing with Aster and just things that I noticed. First of all, if you're installing graphics drivers, you want to turn off Aster. Especially the NVIDIA ones really throw some just weird errors if you have Aster enabled. If you disable Aster, it installs normally. AMD just messes up all the screen configs when you install it with Aster, so it's better to just disable it first. The next thing I noticed was AMD GPUs seem to have issues with sleep, where they'd go to sleep and then they just couldn't wake up and start again, so you'd have to just do a hard reboot. NVIDIA seemed to be fine though, so that seems to be a weird issue there. The other thing I noticed was when you have a screen resolution change in one session, like when entering a game at a non-native resolution, all the other screens kind of just blink and flash for half a second. And the last thing I'm going to comment about is the Aster GUI. I just say I think it needs a little bit more polish. Some of the way the buttons were indented versus not seemed a bit odd for me. And also the warning messages, the ones saying that you have to have two monitors connected to the same GPU, would show up when I was fixing the error, which seemed odd to me. Nothing that really stopped me from using it, but it just was a bit of, I feel like a little bit more testing could go in and make it a better product. In conclusion, I'm pretty impressed with Aster after all of this testing. It looks like a pretty good alternative to using virtual machines for multiple sessions, and is often better in many situations, especially if you're reusing a gaming PC in comparison to buying new hardware for virtualization. It's a lot less picky about what hardware you use, and it's pretty much plug and play for most systems I've played with. If you're in the use case where you want to have your friend come over and play games on one PC every week, it's pretty good. You can find an old monitor and keyboard and mouse for often very cheap, pay to $60 for 2 sessions on the hardware, and for maybe $100 a second PC for a friend every week, that's not an awful price. For the larger scale use cases, for example libraries, educational settings, businesses, I've heard many people liking this where computer cost is a major issue, because you can't get very good $100 PCs, but you can get a reasonable $800 PC and split it often much better. Now, in general though, the industry for business type situations seems to be moving away from multi-point and much more towards having like a laptop for every user or a separate desktop. Because often in business situations, the cost of the computer is not a major part of IT costs, and things like software licensing and IT personnel time are a much bigger part of the budget that's being spent. And just saving a little bit by changing it into a multi-seat configuration really won't benefit you. The other disadvantage is kind of security and users. For the friend playing games at your house, it's not really a huge issue. You guys are friends and normally I would expect not to try to mess with each other. But in other environments where users might not be so friendly, I could see many issues, where you could possibly mess with other sessions much more so than virtual machines and much more so than with separate systems, where you could break your system but it's very hard to break someone else's. If you were to set up Aster or any other similar software in an environment, I'd say put a good amount of testing to make sure someone can't mess with other users. Because for example, by default, shutdown's enabled on all users, so if someone wants to have fun, they can just shut it down for everyone and just kind of stop all their current work. Thanks for watching this update on my Aster video. Let me know if you have any other questions or tests I could run in the future to look more into this software. And thanks for watching.